Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Fulco. I'm Agnita M. Stine Schreiber Curator at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts in Hagerstown, Maryland. And it is my pleasure to welcome you back to the latest edition of the Curator's Den. And today, I am going to talk to you about some Baroque art in our collection. And this is in conjunction with a special exhibition that is on view at the museum now, and that I encourage you to come and attend if you are able to. The program today is sponsored by Mr. Louis Kawaja. I'm going to be looking at several works by two Italian artists and then one by an artist from the Netherlands. And these were all made sometime between the late 1600s and the early 1700s. This presentation today is done in conjunction with that special exhibition that I mentioned, Bernini and the Roman Baroque Masterpieces from Palazzo Chigi in Aricia, which is on view through September, as you can see there. And you're going to see the works that I'm presenting today discussed in another context for my second lecture that is upcoming on August 12th at 6 o'clock. And I hope that you'll be able to join me for that. But today what we're going to do is we're going to look and see how these paintings fit in with the museum's history and also in the broader context of Roman art. And look at some very interesting issues connected to them. But I just wanted to put that out there that these works, you may see them come back in my second lecture, but they will be in relation to specific works that are in the Bernini and the Roman Baroque show. So stay tuned for that. To situate you with the context that we're looking at today, geographically, we're going to be talking about actually Genoa. We'll also be mentioning Rome and a little bit about Naples. We'll also talk about the relationship between Genoa, which is an important city in the province of Liguria in northern Italy, in the early and mid 1700s, and its relationship to Antwerp, specifically what's today Belgium, in exchange. How does that inform, how does it change Italian Baroque art? So this is just to give you a sense of where we're going virtually. But a little background before I launch into my discussion today. These paintings that we're looking at go back to a time in the museum's history with a very significant director, and he's shown here on the upper left, named Bruce Etchison. He was the director from 1949, 1950 to 1964, and here you can see him on television explaining a portrait that is done in the tradition of Rembrandt, but that for many years was believed to be a Rembrandt. I discussed it before in previous Curator's Dens, and also in Let's Talk Art, for example. But I bring him in here because he is the one who was responsible for acquiring the works that we're looking at today, two of them, the first two. And the painting that's going to be the first subject of our discussion is this painting that depicts St. Michael defeating Satan, which was given by an important donor to the museum, Mr. Stuart Houston of Coatesville, Pennsylvania, which is just southwest of and outside of Philadelphia. Mr. Houston's an important figure in the museum because he donated a number of pieces, two of which we're going to be looking at today. His name will come up again, but essentially he was a connection to our former director, Bruce Etchison. Bruce Etchison also oversaw the acquisition of this painting depicting Lot and his daughters. So that just places it a little bit within our context in Hagerstown. And of course, these relationships would not have been able to come about without the assistance of Bruce Silverman, shown on the left here, with Bruce Etchison at a reception at the museum for an exhibition in 1964 of old masters. And what was important was Bruce Silverman was a key art dealer in New York between the late 1930s all the way through the mid 60s. He dealt in old master paintings, and he helped facilitate many acquisitions for the museum, and specifically in introducing clients of his to Bruce Etchison, who may become potential donors. And that was certainly the case with Stuart Houston here shown on the right. So this was an important part of how the museum got to know these certain individuals. Here's Bruce standing with a painting that was on loan to our museum for some number of years, believed to be done in the tradition of Albrecht Dürer, but actually not by Dürer himself. And Bruce is shown here standing in the gallery, looking at it and preparing to speak about it in a newspaper clipping here at the time of our 25th anniversary exhibition back in the 1950s. So a little bit of history. Now, what's really interesting about this painting was when I first got to the museum, it was displayed very high up on the Schreiber gallery wall, which is our gallery for old master paintings, and it piqued my curiosity. It had been studied by several of the museum's Samuel H. Kress Foundation fellows, but they came to some different conclusions about the authorship. And when I discovered the connection to Mr. Houston, I became particularly intrigued by his role. This was actually his first gift to the museum. And I should mention that it had had a number of attributions on it before it got here. But I did some research, and as I'm going to explain, I believe that it is not done by the previous artists to which it has been attributed. And I think it is actually done by either this painter you're looking at, he's Roman, Benedetto Luti, or a member of his workshop. And I came to these conclusions based upon the use of color and form, and also the compositional technique as a whole. Benedetto Luti, in addition to painting religious subjects that you see here, he also was a pastelist. By that, I mean he created these pastel portraits. This one in the middle is an engraving likely done after the artist's own self-portrait in pastel. Pastels became very popular in the late 17th and specifically well into the 18th century. So this artist that we're looking at, Luti, he was originally from Florence, but what he does is he settles down in Rome. He has his ground training in Florence, but then he makes his way to Rome. And he had a number of very key patrons, including Cosimo III Medici, among the last Medici of Florence, the rulers of Tuscany. And then he came to Rome, where he received patronage from many artists, actually, that had patronized Gian Lorenzo Bernini, including the members of the Colonna family, Pallavicini, the Barberini, and the Odescalchi family. So some very important patrons there. But what led me to believe we were looking at a different artist is the use of this color. And I'm going to talk about it a bit more. In addition to the fact that some of the previous attributions were not accounting for the use of oil sketches. As you see here with one of Luti's confirmed works, Christ on the Mount of Olives, that's in the Salzburg Museum's collection. So we'll draw those to comparison in just a little bit. But here we've got on the left the original attribution to our painting in the collection that you see here of St. Michael. It was when it came to the museum, it was attributed to the Spanish artist who worked in Italy. It says on the label here, Giuseppe de Ribera. And Ribera was a Spanish follower of Caravaggio. He worked for quite some time in Naples. He first trained in Rome. He fell under the influence of Caravaggio. And how this attribution got put on the St. Michael painting is not entirely clear. However, I could test that, and my other colleagues have too, because Ribera's style is very different. He doesn't use those bright reds, those oranges. Instead, he uses a darker palette, more in the vein of Caravaggio. He uses tenebrous technique, dramatic chiaroscuro, like you see here in the Martyrdom of St. Andrew, which is in the Museum of Fine Arts, Budapest. So that you're looking at a totally different artist. The subjects are much grander. He focuses more on musculature rather than building up anatomical proportions and features using color. Now, one of my other colleagues who was a Kress fellow, Dr. Leopoldine Prosperetti, in the late 2000s, had thought that our St. Michael might have been done by Luca Giordano. However, I am of a different opinion because, again, Giordano, he often will use very loose brushwork, but in a work like this, he tightens it up, and it's actually quite academic. His representation of the eyes, the anatomical proportions, are much more exacting than, for example, the new attribution I proposed, Benedetto Luti, which is closer to our painting. And I think one of the things that led my other colleague to believe this is the very famous representation that we see here of the fall of the rebel angels from circa 1666 by Giordano in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. I thought that perhaps our painting might be a preliminary sketch for this, but I'm not quite certain about that. I think that it's more likely for a totally different commission by a different artist in his workshop. So moving back to our painting, thanks to a very important grant from the Stuart Houston Charitable Trust, which is a foundation in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, that maintains the legacy of Stuart and his philanthropic endeavors in Pennsylvania, and also for other institutions that received gifts from him, we've been able to clean this painting and restore it to its former glory. And these photographs here show you the evolution of this process of the workshop of Benedetto Luti painting. This is what it looked like originally. very darkened. The color is not particularly distinct. When conserved here, and this is the work in process, those old varnish layers are taken off, and you get to see what the artist's original intentions were. You can see how the rays of light are beaming down here on St. Michael as he's getting ready to launch his spear there. And I should mention that this is a very important subject that you see in art. Giordano, of course, treated it. It's from the New Testament's book of Revelation, in which God charged Archangel St. Michael with leading his armies against Satan's forces during the war in heaven. In our painting, which is very lively and dramatic, the artist does make use of this chiaroscuro. And St. Michael is seen armed with a spear and chain. He's suspended in air, and he prepares to capture Satan, sending him plunging back into the depths of hell. It's likely that an associate of Luti's workshop would have worked on this, perhaps with the supervision of the master himself. And the piece that we have in the museum, I believe, is what we call a modello, or preparatory oil sketch, which you can see many examples in the Bernini exhibition we have on view now. These were the first idea of the artist that would be presented to their patron at the time. And the idea was that the patron would look at it and decide whether or not they wanted to proceed with the idea, the initial idea presented by the artist, would suggest changes, and those would be made to the final very large altarpiece. And this is what the painting looks like after restoration, bringing back the colors, the original intention of the artist. Here, you can see how the light shines down on Satan, the details of his wings, and you can also see his claw here. St. Michael's used the chain to trap him. So it really shows quite nicely. It's on view in the lobby of the museum, and I encourage you to come back and see it. On the left, the before, very darkened, and on the right, really quite brightened up. It's much more vibrant, and you get to see what's actually going on in the painting. Luti, in his workshop, specialized in creating frescoes, oil paintings, and pastels. As I mentioned, both religious and secular subjects. Luti would go on to train a significant generation of artists in Rome, including Giovanni Paolo Panini, French artist Charles-André Fonlot, and many others, Fonlot being a court painter to King Louis XV of France. Paintings like this were very important in asserting Roman Catholic beliefs during the Catholic Counter-Reformation in Italy and other parts of Europe. And the basis for my reattribution comes from the use of the colors, as well as the elements in the sky, the atmospheric effects. See those oranges? We see them playing out in the Hagerstown painting down below. Here's one of Luti's works called The Oration in the Garden of Olives, shown here. Again, you can see how this is working. Also, another thing that got me onto Benedetto Luti is the shape of the eyes, as well as the hands, the facial expressions of the figures. We see this also in a study he did of the penitent Magdalene from about the late 17th to the early 18th century. The coloristic inspiration is critical when you're trying to look at a reattribution, or Christ on the Mount of Olives here. Like our painting, this is an oil sketch. Note the sky up above with those oranges and browns that are incorporated in, and also the oval eyes of the figures. See how the anatomical proportions are not as exacting as Luca Giordano we saw before. We can see that here with the St. Michael. Some attention to detail to the anatomy, but it's actually more about color. And it's really amazing, our painting, especially after restoration, is you can see the light shining down on his head, representing the divine good nature of God and of St. Michael, triumphing over the evil darkness over here of Satan. And see how there's the fires of hell are alluded to down below with this burst of flames. It's just a wonderful work of art. Now, transitioning from that, we move on to another painting attributed formerly to Giovanni Andrea da Ferrari. And here we have a picture that is actually Genovese. And by that I mean that it was produced in and around Genoa. A prolific easel painter, Giovanni Andrea da Ferrari created many religious subjects, such as the one you're looking at. But again, after I looked at this picture, I thought that we were looking at something that was actually not by this artist Ferrari, and I'm going to explain why. Again, one of my colleagues had a different opinion. This often happens in art history where art historians have different beliefs about what the authorship of a specific work is. What I will say to give you an overview is that the artist to whom I've attributed to, possibly collaborating with Giacomo Leggi here, you have a work that's done in the tradition of Caravaggio. Originally, when it came to the museum, it was thought to be by somebody in the circle of, or even by Jan Lievens, who is a slightly older artist than Rembrandt. He was a rival of his in Leiden. And this is not the case. After more research, this painting really does show the influence in the blending of both Flemish tradition in the north and Italian forms in the south. So we can leave behind the Jan Lievens attribution. Again, we're looking more here at a Caravaggesque tradition. Strong contrast between light and dark, and the tremendous emotion that you see here with Caravaggio, using people from daily life, from the experience of the artist, and actually pulling those in. This is part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation that makes us want to believe more what we're seeing in order to understand and grasp the teachings of the Catholic Church more. I've reattributed it to Domenico, pardon the typo there, Domenico Fiasella and Giacomo Leggi, who were both artists working in Genoa in the mid to late 1600s. It was a gift of Hobart McVicker Agnew, who was an ophthalmologist who worked in New York and New Jersey in the 50s and 60s and happened to collect some of this artwork. And as you can see here, Lot and his daughters are being led out of Sodom. And this is actually an angel. It's hard to see in this photograph, but actually this figure has wings and it's leading the figures out of the scene. It's happening outside of a home as these figures are being led away. And here's Lot right there. A little bit about it. This subject is quite well known throughout history. And basically, it is the story of the life, it comes from the story of the lives of the patriarchs in the Old Testament. A kinsman of Abraham, Lot was the only male to survive the destruction of Sodom. However, he disturbingly had incestuous relations with his daughters in order to ensure the continuance of the human race. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, Lot was often considered to be the embodiment of licentiousness, of adultery in many cases. And a narrative like this was intended to warn viewers against the dangers of succumbing to amorous temptation, while also providing an opportunity for the depiction of erotic sensuality. Now, this one doesn't really show the erotic sensuality that much. It focuses on this moment in time within the episode. The fact that it's occurring, at least in Fiasella and Leggi's mind, at night. Here's a detail of the bag that one of the daughters carries. Look at how engaging she is. She looks right out at the viewer, making us wonder what's going on in the scene. And over here is a maidservant, often something we see in the work of Caravaggio. Ferrari's technique does bear some resemblance to our painting in Hagerstown, but this is actually quite different in my view. Some resemblance, particularly in terms of the way the light shines on the figures, the use of the highlights on one of Lot's daughter's faces, as well as Lot himself, gestures. But as you're going to see, the artist I'm looking at, Fiasella, is quite different. Fiasella, again, being Genoese. Having gone to the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art a couple of years ago, that's when it sort of drove it home to me that I was looking at very much possibly the work of Fiasella, or at least his workshop, particularly when I saw Christ's face here, the nose, the modeling of the hands and the figures, the use of the light is in many regards very similar to this daughter that you see over here. This is another one. This is part of the series, Christ Healing the Blind, also in the John and Mabel Ringling Museum. And then when I found this one, by the way, his nickname is Il Sarzana after his hometown, this being a collaboration between the artist and likely Giacomo Leggi, who is a still life and a market scene painter, that's when it drove it home to me, whereby the figures are really quite close. So what I'm arguing is that Leggi, who did this painting here in another museum in France, likely collaborated with Fiasella to produce the painting that we have in ours. Particularly when you look at the face here in the depiction of Samson and Delilah, this really comes through quite significantly. Also the use of the drape and the maidservant is another tip-off for me. Because of the use of the light, also the wrinkles on the old woman's face, it's quite striking. So from there, I'd like to conclude briefly with a painting that I've also reattributed. And this had come on, again, from the gift of Stuart Houston. It's on view in the lobby of the museum right now. And I've reattributed it to an artist named Alexander van Galen, who came from Amsterdam, but actually moved around a bit in Europe. He worked in the Netherlands, but he eventually would end his career in England doing commissions for Queen Anne. And he trained under a battle painter named Jan van Hoogtenberg. And this painting depicts a very dramatic battle, not of a specific scene in particular from historical events, but made up by the artist. These were very popular in the 1600s and even into the 1700s because they depicted grand architecture, and in particular, the use of billowing smoke, the use of ruins. And in this case, it looks like Europeans clashing with non-Western peoples. In this case, I'm arguing Ottoman Turks. The fact that the suggested here that Ottoman Turks bring about the downfall of Western civilization, hence the ruins. A statue, perhaps, of a goddess of a historical figure. We can see figures with turbans who are racing off towards the right here. It's a very dramatic scene, but it doesn't pinpoint to a specific location. In the 1600s, you had a lot of the confrontations between the Ottoman Empire and the Europeans, particularly because the Ottomans were invading Europe. Think of the Siege of Vienna in 1683. You can see how Galen, the artist I'm looking at, was being influenced by Jan van Hoogtenberg, but actually the artist has a much looser, sketchier style. Here's another battle scene by him with the use of the temple and the architecture on the right-hand side, the billowing smoke, all of the drama. That's what's led me to believe that we're looking at a different artist. If you compare the two slides here, you can see that. But very interestingly, Alexander van Galen, the artist, also looked at other painters, particularly Philips Wouwerman, who was a Dutch painter, for inspiration, though Wouwerman has a much tighter style that you see here on the left. Other artists whose work you may have known included Agnello Falcone, who was a Neapolitan artist, battle scene of the mid-17th century. Another work by somebody in his circle. Notice the use of the ruined column, very much tying us into the fact that our artist, Galen, was well aware of these techniques and innovations in battle paintings of the mid-1600s. Here's Jacques Courtois with his battle, and you can see the relationship on the right with Galen. So thank you for joining me today, and I will look forward to welcoming you back to another edition of the Curator's Den, in which we're going to look at some other old masters and see how they relate to the Roman Baroque specifically. Thank you very much, and I hope that you have a nice weekend.